Welcome everyone to another edition of D&I One-on-One. Today we're talking about neurodiversity. So I'm Jina Etienne. I am a certified diversity executive and I'm also a CPA. In my practice, I do training, consulting, workshops, keynotes, all in the space around inclusion, awareness, belonging, mindfulness, and understanding these different dimensions that make us all who we are. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm especially excited to have with me today James Deignan. James has a wealth of experience in neurodiversity and a strong commitment to fostering neurodiversity and inclusion in the workplace. He has been a trailblazer in promoting inclusive policies and practices across multiple industries. We met at the Forum for Workplace Inclusion this last spring, where he was doing a presentation, and I immediately knew I wanted to follow up and talk with him. So today he's going to share valuable insights on how we can create more inclusive environments that embrace neurodiversity and empower everyone to thrive. Outside of his work, I learned that James likes spending time outdoors with his fiance Kelsey and his dog Hattie. And they do things on the weekends like hiking and golfing, which I can't golf, so I appreciate that. And he always likes bonding over food as a talented cook. So James, that's a lot. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Jina, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. Really excited for our conversation.
So for the first question, maybe what I'll toss out to you is the topic in general, neurodiversity. There are a lot to be passionate about. Why neurodiversity for you?
Well, I think neurodiversity is a term that's often misunderstood from just the general population. I think people that have familiarity with it, understand the nuance. But from a general perspective, there's a lot of gaps. And so when I think of neurodiversity, I think of difference in thought, right? You kind of get that from the natural name of it. But when you go and start to break down neurodiversity, it's just difference in thinking, really, I think is the best way to summarize it. And when we think about thought and how to accomplish a problem or take on a task, it's often a linear process. And we follow steps 1, 2, 3, and so on. And what neurodiversity, I think, has really recognized is that not all thinking is linear. It doesn't always follow that clean path, and that often individuals can arrive at the same, if not better, answer when following a different thought process. So neurodiversity, difference in thought, but really what are the underlying superpowers that are often overlooked when we think about the negatives of neurodiversity?
I love the use of the word superpower, because I think a lot of times, to your point, neurodiversity is seen, and we've heard this as well, often people think autism, like that's the first thing that comes to mind, and that's because the term originated in work being done by a psychologist who herself was on the autism spectrum. But we now know it's much broader than that. And some of us, our brains work a little differently. And when I'm allowed to process things in my own way, I'm either going to get there faster, it's going to be easier, maybe I'm going to be able to be more clear in my thinking. So I don't know, I think it's really important for us to understand, but I do want to ask one question, challenge a little bit. It's not just thinking, right? It's also that our brains are literally wired differently. So while it's thinking, there are some things that do show up, like autism on the spectrum. It is a different way of thinking, but it's also a different way of processing all of the information around you, right? And in fact, I'm going to put this on the screen. I created this graphic to help people understand that it is continual, it's ongoing, it's interconnected, and it's all of these things. Thinking is on here somewhere, right? Did I not put thinking on here?
Thinking encompasses most of the skills that you've had on here, I think.
I need to put it on here, note to self. But yeah. So what are your thoughts about being all of these things and not just thinking differences?
Well, I love how you called out that, what I was alluding to before when I say that there's misunderstandings is that when you say neurodiversity, especially in the workplace, people automatically think autism and only autism. So an autism, can present itself in a specific manner that I think is misunderstood as well. And when you break down these misunderstandings and provide the information that this is comprehensive in terms of, yes, thinking, but how people approach their daily lives and how they are going to tackle a task or interact with somebody is all wrapped up in neurodiversity. So yes, it's a way of thinking. I completely agree there, but it is also a way of life as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. We know the data tells us, and this is nothing new. When you see somebody who's different from the majority norm, we almost immediately their status or stature or perceptions of them are diminished. So if you have an accent, if you have a visible disability, or if you behave differently in the workplace, the presumption is we're all out extroverts. We know even that's not the case. And neurodivergent, as people start to understand the word, has your experience been that word has negative connotations, or are people more curious about it or open about it as you've been doing this work over the last several years?
I think it depends on who you talk to and where they're at in their own kind of confidence, understanding, where they're at in their career, where they're at in their life. I myself have been very comfortable talking about my neurodivergence and how when I was diagnosed, how it has impacted me over the course of school and work life. Where my work, with working with Fortune 500 companies, I find that many individuals are a bit more reserved in talking about the challenges that neurodiversity has put in front of them due to, just fear of retribution or fear of prejudice in some way. Because when you look at neurodiversity, yes, it's a term that is coming into the DE&I kind of spectrum and being included in the conversation, but you don't see upper management disclosing or calling out that they might be struggling or thinking in a different way. So without having a leader to kind of come out and lead the conversation, it's really difficult. Now, one thing I do want to kind of put a pin in is that organizations that have really strong ERG groups that focus on neurodiversity and have a strong leader around that often have much more vocal staff about their experiences, what they're feeling, and really, how comfortable they are.
So my bad for not doing this. Beryl, let's go ahead and launch this first polling question, because we just went off and started talking about it. And it would be nice to know, how familiar are the folks joining us today with the topic?
Great, so I have gone ahead and launched that first polling question. It should be up on screen. We will leave each polling question open for about 60 seconds for you to get your votes in. And as long as you answer 3 of the 4 polls today and are logged in for 50 minutes, you'll earn your full CPE credit.
I always try to start with the polling question to set up the conversation. I didn't do it today. But to your point, sorry, go ahead, James.
You were too excited.
I was too excited, yeah. And to your point, I think, I believe you touched on this. We're just hearing this a lot more, and I think the words themselves are no longer, I'm sorry, what did you say? What are you talking about? So hopefully, we're at least starting to see that. We'll know from this poll.
Yeah, let me go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. I will share the results on screen. It looks like 37% of the audience is saying this is all too new to me, 30% a little familiar, 26% somewhat, 8% very.
So there you go. There's a nice little mix there. But we have quite a few people who haven't heard about it, that this isn't all new to me. So I'm going to throw out, I don't think we have, let me see if we put it in the slides. I don't think we did. So can we do a quick walkthrough of the language. So you've got neurodiversity, neurodivergent, neurodivergence, neurotypical. There are all of these words. Do they all mean the same thing? Not neurotypical, sorry, but other than that, do they all mean the same thing? Are they interchangeable?
That depends on who you talk to. I would say in a discussing this topic where there is a lot of nuance and level of detail that might not be, it's absolutely relevant to the topic, but might not be relevant to the discussion about neurodiversity in the workplace. It's better to just use them interchangeably to avoid confusion and really kind of not diving too deep depending on the audience is what I've found.
So there's a question in the queue, and I think I'm going to go here. Both of us love this graphic. The question is, does dyslexia belong here? And the reason I thought this would be a good time to bring this up and address that question is some of the terms themselves here are terms that people aren't familiar with, or these dimensions or types of neurodiversity. And so do I say, for example, do I refer to the type, so Tourette's, dyslexia, ADHD, my slides are over here, that's what I'm looking at. Do I refer to that, or do I say neurodiverse if I'm having a conversation about something? I mean, there's this fear of being politically correct, or there's this anxiety, especially around D&I, of saying the wrong thing and then you offend somebody. Any tips or tricks here?
I have found that it's easier to, well, it's easier, but it's also probably advisable to stick to the term neurodiversity until you truly understand what somebody's challenges are or superpowers are, for that matter, because there's a lot of intersectionality in how these differences in thinking present themselves. So what, somebody that might have ADHD may also have, be on the autism spectrum as well. So there's tons of intersectionality when you look at neurodivergence. So I think without understanding somebody's situation, it's better to stick to the general terms.
And what I love about this particular graphic, and hopefully you all have downloaded the slides so you can see these, or the screen is big enough. But look on the right, like at 3 o'clock, ADHD. And then just above it is dyslexia. Just below it, Tourette's. And what you see is in the crossover is what looks to be a superpower. And so, for example, between ADHD and dyslexia, authenticity is a superpower, even though within ADHD, it manifests itself in certain ways: creativity, hyperfocus, energy, passion. And I think what I love about this is all of this is framed in the positive. You were saying at the very beginning, unlocking those powers. Were you thinking about these powers, the crossover, or were you thinking about the individual powers themselves? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I was talking about the crossover and how when you look at ADHD on its own, or autism or dyslexia, it often has a negative connotation to it. Struggle with reading, struggle with focus, trouble with social interactions. Those are kind of the terms or scenarios that you hear associated with these ways in thinking. And I think what is missed is this intersectionality, right? Of what's the positive spin on the negative that we put out there. And ADHD is something that I struggle with, and I think for the longest time I always thought, oh well, you can't focus, or you can't focus. Well, no, I have the ability to focus. There's, if you put me in a room with something that I'm truly interested in doing, I might not emerge for hours, but if it's something that I'm not interested in, I can't pay attention to it for 10 seconds. So they interact, the challenge and output can be viewed in different ways. And I think that's what's overlooked when you think about neurodiversity.
So I don't have a problem sharing, and I'm okay. I was going to ask you, and I thought, oh, I didn't get permission to ask this question, so feel free to say no. ADHD, how long ago was your diagnosis? For me, I wasn't diagnosed until my early 40s. And I share that because you just said something that really resonated, that everything seemed to be framed in a negative. And in my mind, I had all of these stories growing up about why I wasn't ... Come to find out, I have ADHD and I was ... But I focused on the things I weren't, I weren't. Whichever of those English is right, that's the one I'm trying to say. And I have learned to lean into the superpower. I attended this training program. It was phenomenal. And one of the things that they did was they had us go through and doing, there are a lot of assessments. And what they said was you have two choices. You can spend a lot of effort trying to rehabilitate the things that are weaker for you, or really lean into those superpowers and knock it out of the park. And so I wish we'd had that conversation around neurodiversity.
Well, I can say in terms of my diagnosis, so I was diagnosed in high school timeframe. My mom had a background in early childhood development, so she could see kind of the writing on the wall and happened to get me help outside of school, which is actually a really positive because when I was growing up, these these challenges weren't really they were considered learning disabilities or learning challenges, and that often put you in different classrooms or different learning groups. And that was something that my mom strove to avoid, because in the classroom I did just fine. It was just I struggled with certain specific tasks.
Right.
And so by seeking help outside of school, I was able to kind of mask, which we can talk about at some point, but it was masking in the positive because I wasn't grouped into a group with a title on it, especially a negative title. So my diagnosis was early enough that I think I had some understanding of the challenges in front of me. I didn't understand the superpowers that I had until I became a professional and I had to accomplish tasks on my own and there was no oversight. And I was like, hey, I know they told me I could do this, steps 1 through 10, but I know that I can do this with the same exact results. That's really important with people sometimes. If you skip steps, it's got to have the same result.
Right.
I can skip steps or do the steps in a different order and get a better result. And it wasn't until, my professional career where I've actually done that analysis and saying, well, when you leverage the skills that you really have, it is quite a superpower, or superpowers to have.
Yeah, that comment is particularly important because in the accounting industry, and most of our attendees work somewhere along the continuum in the accounting profession, we're a highly disciplined, structured, almost like you have to do it in these orders and tick your way down the checklist or you're not going to get it right. We don't always focus on the outcome. And sometimes we over focus on input. And then the challenge with input is, well, you have to do it this way because this is the way I learned how to do it. And I don't know about you, but I've come across over the course of my career, people are telling me how they do it. And I mean, logically, I'm smart enough to hear and see it makes sense. And yet I'm struggling to do the thing that it seems easy. How does that fit into the neurodiversity conversation?
Well, it resonates because we're, and it kind of goes back to my school experience of hiding and masking a little bit, is that we have these social structures and processes that we have, made up in a different time with different circumstances, and we've just adopted them and really not challenged the workplace, the thought process, the bias that we have.
It's just how we do it.
We haven't challenged it. Yeah. And, I think now that individuals that have neurodivergence are coming into the spotlight in a lot of scenarios, especially when, many businesses were struggling to find some very specific talent over the last couple of years. they were able to, ones that were aware of neurodiversity were able to secure a very specific skill set by looking for individuals that had these challenges. So,
or talents,
yeah,
also.
Yeah, I say challenges. I revert to challenges because I think that's what we're prone to and used to. Superpowers is absolutely what I believe, but it's often in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah, beauty in the eyes of the beholder, right? I'm going to go ahead and open the second poll because you touched on something around education. And I think this is really interesting because in our planning calls, we did talk a couple of times about this. And it's tying into what we said a minute ago. How we process information is highly individualized. Even if you don't have ADHD or dyslexia or dyscalculia or any of these things, we still all process things differently. It doesn't necessarily mean we're neurodiverse because some of that comes with an actual formal diagnosis. But how does this play out? I'm curious to see how people answer this question. And then maybe you can speak to this whole thing about reading because you have some really great insights there in terms of how what our brains are doing in order to do things like write or to read or to process information. Where are we, Beryl? Are we almost
We
done?
are just about done with this poll, so I'm going to leave it open for about 5 more seconds. 3, 2, and 1. Got an interesting bell curve going on with these answers. It looks like 40% of the audience is saying 7th to 8th grade. I'll turn it over to you for the answer.
Okay, James, what's the answer?
The majority was right. 7th to 8th grade is the most realistic there. So the average reading age in the United States and Canada is 10 to 13 years old, and that encompasses 6th to 8th grade. So to give you an example of books that would fall into that category, Holes or The Giver are both examples that fall in middle school reading. So not very advanced when you look at the content enclosed within those books. The scary thing is that the average American has this reading age, but at the same time, when we look at the content we put out into the world, on average, it's written to 20 plus. So how do we expect our colleagues, our customers, our friends to understand the information that we're putting out in the world, and they just don't have the reading ability? So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it goes a step further when you look at English as a second language or neurodiversity, and you compound all of these behaviors or thought processes into the workplace. A term that I like to use that comes about is cognitive inclusion, and I think that's a real gap in the workplace. Is that when people arrive at work, we do these extensive interviews for character and skill set and all of that, but we rarely test for reading and writing ability because it's a general assumption that everybody can do that when we know that's now not the case.
What's interesting about that, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up here. First of all, the population in the country is more likely to have neurodivergent people in any group of 100. Anywhere from 15 to 25 of them may be neurodivergent. And it's interesting because I don't think we think about that. We understand when you're interviewing me for a job, let's say in an accounting firm, do I know the formulas? Do I know the process? Do I understand the principles of accounting? Yes. So I can do the technical stuff. But how well could I write an article? Or could I speak at an event on behalf of the firm? Or how would I do in a client meeting? Because we know with some of these eye contact, we might be less inclined to make eye contact. With some of these, we might be very self-conscious about our body movements. And you put in a disproportionate amount of energy to try to hold all of that in. It's costing you effort in doing your job. trying to see this other one here. You like this one as well. This report came out from EY, and what was it about this one that jumped out at you?
So I love this because every year Ernst & Young does Entrepreneur of the Year. And how they do it is they have different categories, and then they have different entrepreneurs for each category. And then it goes by country. So there's thousands of entrepreneurs that apply for this. And then one is selected often by country, and then they go and compete to be the sole entrepreneur of the year. What's amazing about this stat is that you have some of the brightest minds in the world in technology, in medicine, in healthcare, in security, and more than 3/4 of these people identify as being neurodivergent in some way. Now, this is specifically dyslexia, but again, you compound those other aspects that I mentioned earlier, and everybody struggles in some way. It's just how it presents itself. And by just seeing these people that are really kind of my hero, like eventually I want to be an entrepreneur, running my own business or whatnot, to know that, people have come before me and had, similar kind of social challenges put up in front of them, when they know that they have the skill set to overcome that, is just, puts a lot of faith and energy back into me.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You talked about interviews. I'm going to go back to this slide. Let me see if it's up here. So it's not specifically there, but autism on the left over here, concentration, fine detail processing, memory. We know that that manifests itself in a number of different ways, whether it's a lot of it is sensory and communication. At least that's the most common form, the most common aspects that we're aware of. I heard a really interesting presentation by a woman who worked at Microsoft, talking about how they interview people in some of their roles, because there's a higher instance of autism in their workforce, especially in the teams that she managed. And so they interviewed them. A large part of it wasn't verbal. So tell me about your last job. It was sit them down and have them play a video game and observe. And it's to your point earlier, if you understand the challenge, if you understand the type of neurodivergence, then you can find a way to navigate, communicate, interact with that person in a way that puts both of you at ease.
Yeah, and I'd like to take that a step further. You understand the work, what's like actually required to do the job in the workplace. I think often, as I was saying before, we interview and hire, if you're in sales, they might ask you sales related questions, or if you're in marketing or accounting or whatever, they'll ask you questions specific to the job role, but
Right.
often the skills that are associated with actually doing that job are hard to test for, right? And so I think what we're saying of watching somebody play a video game or play with Legos or build something, to see their process and how they go about setting it up, can be really instrumental in getting the right hires. To build upon that, there's just all sorts of additional interview formats that you can do, providing questions ahead of time, basically asking somebody if they want to do a phone or video interview without video, without visual there, because some people are uncomfortable with eye contact, or some people require eye contact. So to your point earlier, it's definitely a spectrum of how it presents itself and what makes people comfortable. But I think that's the best way to approach it.
Yeah. So I wanted to include this article here. It goes to the point you were just making. Two things. One, this article specifically talks about how when you start looking at neurodivergence and then you layer in the complexities of cross-cultural differences, there's a higher instance. For example, let me see, I have the stat here because I didn't want to get it wrong. In some Asian and African countries, eye contact to somebody who's of a higher status or has more authority or is older than you is considered rude. And so children tend to not make eye contact. And as a result, there's a higher instance, this is specific in the UK, that Asian students and students from certain countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., there's a higher likelihood that they're going to be diagnosed as autistic when in fact they're not. And, you know, I heard, I don't know if it was your presentation, a very clear example they gave is to ask a candidate, have you ever had this experience at work? And somebody who is autistic or has a different type of mental processing might just say, yes. Versus what's the interviewer asking? The interviewer is asking them to tell them about the experience, but they didn't literally say, tell me about the experience. So the person just said, it sounds like a yes or no question. I'm going to answer yes or no. And that's a really, I thought it was a very simple and clear example of something many of us either have done or has been asked of us, and we never even gave it a second thought.
So I just wanted to clarify there. Were you saying that, you know, for individuals of Asian ethnicity that they were underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed?
Overdiagnosed, and it was just one example. These were clinicians in the UK evaluating and performing these assessments, and more likely to be diagnosed as autistic when they were from a different culture, and the person making the diagnosis wasn't necessarily understanding those cultural norms around eye contact, the types of things you say in response, showing certain types of deference. This is true in work environments when I'm evaluating somebody's performance. If this person is dyslexic and I notice mistakes in their writing, I might believe that they're not as competent, when in fact they're very competent, it's just showing up differently. By the way, I'm going to throw this up here because I loved the idea of coming up and sharing with people. This is not as, what do we say, 15 to 25% of the population is neurodivergent. And there's a lot of them right here on the screen.
And of that population, less than 50% are formally diagnosed, which is something to keep in mind as well. And I think that goes back to, at least with like older generations, it wasn't as socially acceptable to talk about neurodiversity. It was think better, think correctly, you know, and follow that. So it's nice to see people coming out and really sharing their neurodiversity pride.
Yeah. Steve Jobs was never formally diagnosed. Jerry Seinfeld said he was self-diagnosed. I was reading about that, but then I don't know, I couldn't find if he was ever actually formally diagnosed after the fact. Just so that you know, so Cher has dyslexia and dyscalculia. Tim Howard has Tourette syndrome. Jennifer Aniston, dyslexic. Billie Eilish, Tourette's. Steve Jobs, autism. And Seinfeld, autism. And it's interesting because we have these preconceived ideas of what these things look like, sound like, and behave like. So there, right there is a big, hopefully that disrupted a lot of these stereotypes right there.
Yeah.
So there are a couple questions coming in, and I want to make sure we have a chance to get to them because so many are great. I'm happy to take some, but I'm going to throw them out there and then, you know, for you to take, and if you want, I can take them too. So the first question is, what is acquired neurodiversity? It also says acquired superpowers, but we've been using superpowers as the way that they, you know, the way that we display them and use them. But acquired, can you talk about that?
Like acquired, right? Like
acquired, yeah.
So my understanding of that, and I'm not going to say that my definition is the answer, but when I think of acquired neurodiversity, I think of all that life throws at us. And you never know what's going to happen. You could experience some type of trauma, whether that be a TBI, a brain aneurysm.
TBI, traumatic brain injury.
Yes, sorry. You could be hit over the head. Yeah, head over the head. There could be a variety of things that happen within your life that take away some type of cognitive ability. And when it takes away cognitive ability, you know, often you're given another skill back as a way to supplement for that loss in skill. And that is my definition of acquired neurodiversity, is something that you lose you lose thinking capacity in one way and but gain in another.
Right, right. And I think that term is used in other ways. Like, for example, they talk about an acquired disability. And disability, I think 1 in 4 adults or people have a disability. As we get older, it becomes a lot higher. Many of us are going to end up with a disability or something that qualifies as a disability. And I think that's important. For those who've heard me speak before, I'm very transparent. I have epilepsy, and it wasn't diagnosed until I think it was like 10 years ago. And I don't know that I had this diagnosis earlier in life. And so acquired then is something that you then take on over time, either because it doesn't present itself until you're older, or to your point, something happens to you, like a traumatic brain injury. Someone asked very early on, how does mental health play into neurodiversity? For example, does bipolar fit here? I'm not sure what mental health actually includes here. And if I can jump in on that first, one of the things around different mental health diagnoses, anxiety and depression and so on, is it's actually different the way that your brain processes information. Anxiety, for example, is worry about something that hasn't happened and may never happen and that you have no control over. Those are very real, palpable feelings. It manifests itself in the body and people think differently. So those are what you're talking about, different thinking styles there. I don't know if you'd like to add to the question about mental health.
Well, I think of mental health and neurodiversity a little bit differently, in the sense that I myself I've been in recovery from alcoholism now for 4 years. And why I bring that up is because I think it directly relates to mental health and how my ADHD impacts that, and vice versa. Is that when I did not manage my ADHD, it managed me, and it presented itself in the form of drinking. And when I began to manage my mental health, aka also my ADHD, I was able to have a better sense of self, a more grounded life. So if those two aren't tied together in some way, I can't tell you directly how it's done, but they definitely have impact on each other.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Some of it is the actual wiring of the brain, and some of it is the resulting challenges with mental health when you have some of these other issues. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Well, and you can't solve one without the other. And so start with the right building blocks by solving for the ADHD, or at least in my mind, ADHD presents where my mind is really loud all the time. It's hard to shut off. I know a lot of people might have that as well, but one way to do that is to numb it, to shut it down. So there's ways to make sure that you find a healthy balance in your life.
And that is so important, because otherwise it tends to stir up negativity.
Exactly.
Negative self-talk, negative behavior. I mean, you just saved it. You're very vulnerable and very brave to share that. So I appreciate you sharing that with all of us. And there are a couple hundred of us here. So thank you.
My attitude is, if it saves anybody else the angst, then we're making progress.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and launch this third polling question. And while that's launched, we have about a minute. So I want to throw out here. Somebody says, congratulations on your sobriety. That's not easy.
Thank you.
Somebody said dyslexic over here, so that they know it. Somebody was saying formally diagnosed, but I see it as an advantage in some ways. Absolutely, Melissa, couldn't agree more. Someone asked about narcolepsy, and can this be included as neurodiversity? I'd be curious, real quick there, James, do you see that?
I am not an MD, so I'm going to leave that one to the doctors. I don't know how narcolepsy presents itself from a cognitive perspective.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's a colleague that I have worked with in the past, and she shared that she has narcolepsy, and one of the medications that helps her is actually an ADHD medication. So my brain, my intellectual side says they're related. To your point, I couldn't say how. And then let's see, we have a
That makes
second
sense.
of three. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that makes sense as well, that the medication for ADHD, which often is an amphetamine, would help somebody with narcolepsy because it keeps them energized, right?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll real quick, if that's all right.
Yeah, I was actually trying to send you a quick chat, and then let's see the results.
There we go. 76% of the audience saying true, 24% saying false.
So what's the answer, James?
That's a loaded question, and I don't know if I came up with that question or not, but
No, I did. All right, sorry, you're right. You're right. I did.
Sorry.
I was going to say studies found that neurodiverse teams are more productive than neurotypical ones, 30%. So there you go. It's true.
It is true, and I'll say that teams that include neurodivergent individuals tend to be that 33% or whatever more productive, I think would probably be how it's phrased.
Well, let's tackle a couple more questions here. And folks, yes, I know there's a fourth polling question. We'll get to that at the end. So let me see. Can I do this in the order they came in to be fair? This is long, and I'm not sure if it's a question, but I'm going to read the whole thing. Let me put my glasses on. I homeschool my son with high functioning autism, and I suspect he also has ADHD and dyscalculia, but he is not diagnosed. Are there any resources you recommend for me to best support him in his learning and launching into the world? He's about to start 9th grade in the fall. And you know what I'm going to say to that, James? On behalf of both of us, I'm going to take a leap of faith out here and say, Julie, you have our contact information. You are more than welcome to reach out to us directly. And we can share what we know and have. And I don't know if there's anything specific that pops up off the top of your head.
There's many things that come to mind, but again, as each situation's nuanced and requires a bit more detail, I'd be happy to chat through some things that I've relied upon and I know others have found success in as well.
Yeah. Next question. When you say reading levels are low, it isn't just word recognition. Is it comprehension, correct?
Yes. I would say it's more comprehension than word recognition.
Although there are some neurodivergent conditions where people have difficulty processing the words themselves, sequencing the letters. We know dyslexia, people think of it just as seeing things in reverse, but sometimes it's difficult to create the word or process the word.
Correct.
Once you get the word, you can understand it. Why we have the majority of reading level is, it's the way it's readed. So I'm just going to paraphrase. Why is the majority of the reading level 7th to 8th grade? We have free education up to the 12th grade. What are the factors that cause this to happen? Oh, that's a big question. I don't know that we're ready to answer that. Any thoughts though?
I don't know the answer to it, why that is the case. I think of my own experience in learning specific subjects like foreign language, for example. I was immersed in foreign language since the 4th grade. I took it all the way through college, and I still have the ability to listen to a conversation and probably understand, but I will lack the ability to reply. So I guess it's, yes, we might have education up past 12th grade. Often you might have individuals that might not complete high school. And then on top of that, if they don't take their education further or they're not immersed in reading and writing on a daily basis, you can kind of forget what you know, if you understand what I mean there.
I'm going to give an example as a CPA. I know I learned math in high school.
This is a good one.
I know I use math in this work. Ask me to do math today, arithmetic, and I will laugh because I can't. And so it doesn't mean I'm mathematically illiterate. It just means the skill is gone because I've stopped using it. I can do it with my hands on a 10 key faster than I can do it in my head. Dating myself now. Someone said they have narcolepsy and they were diagnosed with ADHD and they generally prescribe stimulants for both. Thank you for sharing that. Acquired neurodiversity has a significant impact on mental health. Someone's sharing a comment here. So these are more comments than questions. I don't know if you want to respond to any. I can keep reading.
Well, I definitely agree that acquired neurodiversity has a lot of impact on mental health. You know, there's often trauma, again, that's associated with with acquiring this, and that, you know, in order to really manage your neurodiversity, as I said, you need to kind of unpack that, and you need to understand how it's going to impact your life, because if you don't manage it, it will manage you.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? For the neurodivergent people in the audience who can pass for neurotypical, what do you recommend for telling people in their workplace that you are neurodivergent? Haha, and I wrote down masking because you brought that up earlier. So thank you for asking that question and bringing us back to it. Just a quick time check. We have about 8 minutes. So you want to talk about masking and answering in answering this question?
Yeah, I'm actually conflicted about this because I myself have been applying for roles in the recent past, and you get to that box and it's like, do you have a disability? And it's like, you know, this won't come into consideration. It's for statistics only, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, but is that true? I personally, before, would have said, you know, get out there and talk about neurodiversity, talk about how it impacts your life and how this makes you you know, how it unlocks your superpower. My mindset has changed on that of recent, just because of what I've experienced, where I think it's better to mask until you're through the door. And once you have a job, then if you want to disclose, by all means disclose. That's just my own kind of bias on that I think it can be sometimes looked at as a stigma still.
So we know that there is a stigma associated with mental health. And I think I was asking earlier about, as this conversation and has brought awareness to the topic of neurodiversity, it goes both ways. Because for some people, it doubles down on the belief that these are, I'm going to say, mental brain disabilities, if you will. And for other people, it's just like, wow, that explains a lot. It's freeing.
Yeah.
And so I respect that, and I appreciate. I think the answer to the question here is that, to your point, what's comfortable for you. That we can't make a decision, but there are risks and there's stigma.
Well, and also, like, you have to balance the pros and cons of this too, because masking is exhausting. It takes a ton of energy. You know, you're basically acting for you know, I don't know a better word choice, but and you have to be aware of what you're saying and how you're saying it and all of that. So it can be incredibly exhausting and tiring, and just it can burn people out. So you need to be aware of that, so you know you can manage your job, because it would be a shame to get into an organization and then be burnt out because you know you can't behave in your normal way.
Yeah. Someone asked if neurodiversities are protected under the Americans with Disability Act, and to my knowledge, the answer is no.
That's it. Neurodiversity falls under ADA.
Oh, it does. Okay, I didn't know that. This is good to know.
It's protected class.
Somewhat appreciated my comment about 10 keys. Thank you. All right, so there are a couple of quick ones here, and I'm going to pull up a picture. One of them asked, describe the authenticity superpower, please. And so what I'd ask you to do is take a look at, where is it? Over here, ADHD, and just above it, dyslexia. They're both on the right side. What that is saying is that somebody who has ADHD and that might also have dyslexia might have be more likely to be just sort of open and transparent and direct and not hide things, aka authentic. And it's because of a combination of the things that they do and the way that they behave. So this isn't formal, it's just, you know, what they found to generally be patterns. So I hope that helps. And I would encourage you to come back and look at this slide to see what some of these other superpowers are. That's what we were talking about.
Well, so just comment on those. Like, obviously the superpowers are between the different categories here, but really you could spin kind of any of those to fit any of these specific situations, because you know, you might have somebody that's ADHD that is, you know, very outgoing and, you know, wants a social butterfly, wants to interact with everybody. You could also have that same person, you know, I was saying before, everybody thinks that it presents always as hyperactivity. Well, you might have somebody that's a complete, you know, introvert that is just fine, you know, sitting in the corner and minimizing interaction. So yes, they're presented here in these specific scenarios, but I think they kind of work for any of these thought processes.
And to be clear, introvert and extrovert is more personality than brain neurodiversity. But intersectionality, you talked about it earlier. We're complex beings, and there are all these different elements that make up who we are. I know for me, one of the things that I found validating about the ADHD diagnosis is that my brain does a lot of strategic ideation. It doesn't require any effort on my part, and I didn't know that people didn't think that way. And it explains a lot of the miscommunications I've had in the past professionally. And it lines up with the creativity thing under ADHD. It's just, it was very, when I said before, it was very aha, validating to get the diagnosis, as opposed to feeling ugh and bummed around a diagnosis. Someone asked a question we probably should have talked about before, and that are there proactive ways that organizations can support neurodiversity in their teams?
Yes, 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 and
We
yes.
probably should have talked about that, right?
First and foremost, talking about it, understanding what it is, having an open dialogue. Do your employees struggle with this? We know they do, because it impacts 1 in 5, basically.
The statistics tell us they do, yeah.
Yeah, and again, most of them are underdiagnosed, so they might not even know that they have a superpower or a challenge, you know, depending on how you look at it. So talking about it, educating your staff, the masses, understanding, you know, what the advantages are for these individuals, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses might be, in order to create a work culture and atmosphere where they'll truly succeed. Microsoft, you had mentioned before, phenomenal company when it comes to just inclusion in general. But when it comes to neurodiversity, they have neurodiversity centers where they understand that certain colleagues work better where, you know, there's control over certain types of lighting, there's certain sound scenarios, there's games or ways to provide outlet for somebody. So understanding the work environment and how people are going to thrive, you know, often I think, you know, ping pong tables and games get sometimes miscategorized as, you know, all fun and games sometimes, where it can truly be stress relief or, you know, a way for some people to just kind of express themselves. So understanding the work environment, providing tools. I could go all day really about the workplace, but I think it starts with talking about it within your organization.
So this one last, and it's actually more of a comment. Somebody asked a question about working with or diagnosing their employees. And I would say to that, our job as leaders and managers isn't to diagnose. And to your point, I think if we just talk about it and raise awareness, it creates a safe layer and a safer place for those who are neurodivergent, whether they disclose or not. What we've done is we've created tools everybody can use,
Yes.
but it will definitely support those who are neurodiverse, but those who aren't will benefit from them too. So I am going to do a quick reference and then give you some a moment to compose some closing thoughts when we do that final poll. But before we do, I just want to invite everybody. This is a biweekly webinar series. And 2 weeks from now, I had an amazing conversation last fall with James Deignan about just diversity data and how we analyze it and what it can tell us. And so we're rebroadcasting that in 2 weeks. So I would encourage everyone to join. The page is open for registration now. And with that, you know, Beryl, maybe we go to the last poll. And while that's open, James, any final thoughts.
No, well, I want to thank you for having me today. This has been a wonderful experience. I love the questions and the engagement just because it shows that people are really thinking along the right lines of how do you integrate neurodiversity into your workplace? How can you help your colleagues, your family, your friends experience a better life? So those are really kind of my closing thoughts. And just want to thank everybody for participating today.
Absolutely. I think that the questions are still coming in, and I'm really appreciative of that. The goal of this series is to just raise awareness and help people start to understand. I invite you all to just go in and read more. There's a lot that's coming out about neurodiversity today. And as I mentioned earlier, James' contact information is on his on the page with his bio. I'm going to put that up here on the screen, just along the bottom of the slide. Give him a call, reach out to him on LinkedIn. You're on LinkedIn, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Right there.
And
myself, yeah, and myself as well. We're happy to help. We're here as a resource for you. So thank you, James. This has been wonderful. I wish we had another hour.
Thank you, Jina.